No.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club here in Canberra for today's Westpac address. I'm Misha Schubert, one of the Vice Presidents of the National Press Club, and I'm honoured to chair today's event. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, and I pay my respects to your elders past and present. Thank you to those of us who've joined us today here in Canberra, but also to those of you who are following along with the broadcast on TV, radio or another pocket-sized device, or via the social media conversation. If you'd like to join the conversation online during Tim Costello's address and during the period of questions and answers, we encourage you to do so. Our Twitter handle is @PressClubAust, and the hashtag for today's event is AusWeWant, AUS We Want. It's a great pleasure today to welcome Tim Costello back to the club. In March this year, Tim announced that he would be stepping down from the role of CEO of World Vision Australia after 13 years in that job. He's about to throw off the heavy cloak of management and focus on the work that is his true passion, which is advocacy, through his new role as Chief Advocate for World Vision Australia. And he's here today wearing that hat, but also as the Chair of the Community Council of Australia. Today, he is going to be formally launching a new report by the Community Council of Australia, which is the focus of his speech today. And of course, he's also well known to watchers of politics and Australians more broadly as one half of the brotherly duo that gave Australia our longest-serving federal treasurer, and a really important voice on social and equality issues over a very sustained period of time. The report that Tim is launching today is squarely in that vein, asking Australians to think even more deeply about the kind of society that we might want for ourselves and our nation and how to achieve it. To hear more, would you please welcome to the stage Tim Costello.
Well, thank you very much for being here. The title, The Australia We Want, came from an experience I had in Zimbabwe about 12 years ago. The politics of Zimbabwe were authoritarian, tyrannical. President Mugabe had deregistered World Vision because he wanted to take over the feeding program. We were feeding 15% of the population, and an election was coming up. And in the midst of that troubled time, which hasn't actually passed for Zimbabwe, the churches came together and they said, let's write a document called The Zimbabwe We Want. I remember being quite inspired by their courage and the sophistication of their work, and I am not here to draw any parallels between the political situation in Zimbabwe and Australia, but when I suggested to the peak body of charities the Community Council of Australia represents, we as a charity sector take seriously trying to care for many of the most vulnerable, to advance that glue of trust, reciprocity, empathy, care, feeling often that we're doing it on less funds, with far greater restrictions on some of the values that make us charities. I like to say, business is about for profit. If you don't make a profit, you're not in business. Politics is about power. Who gets power, who then wins and who loses in a budget, and how the nation's run. Charity is the old English word for love. We in the charitable sector are the love sector. We're not doing it for profit. We're not doing it for power. We actually have a set of values that is pretty profound. So when we came together, we said, let's think about the Australia we want. And this is the result of that work that I'm launching today. Douglas Adams, the bloke who wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, said, Australians, alone of all races on earth, seem to be free from the grass is greener on the other side of the fence syndrome. Because here in Australia, we actually believe we are, in fact, on the other side of the fence. Sunny, optimistic, generous, people who know we're blessed, the only nation with a whole continent to ourselves. This report really now questions what's happened to that sunny optimism, that generosity represented in giving and volunteering, the increase of inequality, the shocking increase in incarceration rates. And it says we're not as healthy or humane or as positive as we still like to think we are, that we've actually profoundly turned inwards. The message isn't so much about what can we do for our nation and how do we serve, it's about what can I do for myself. It's all about me, leading often to a victim sense that we're missing out, that someone's getting more. That is a negative solidarity when we get together of pointing the finger at government and being disgruntled, rather than a positive solidarity that really Douglas Adams was talking about. So this report is not a blame game. It's not saying the government ought. It's not blaming any particular part of society, although doing media in Western Australia this morning was difficult. If you read the report of all states and territories, Western Australia comes out worse, and I tried to gently say you've focused on economics, maybe flick the switch now to community and care. But it's not to blame any sector for inequalities that exist. It's to actually say if it's the Australia we want, it's our Australia. We are responsible for the positive change. We can, if we agree with the mood shift in this report, turn this around. We can have the serious conversations and own our part in the challenges that you'll hear about today. So it's really vision casting, not blame throwing, saying it's about our deepest values that resonate with our deepest heart hungers as Australians, and owning that this is our Australia, the Australia we want for our children, for their descendants. This is a challenge for every single one of us. For media, it's a challenge to say, well, don't be utterly cynical. There is love and sacrifice and service in the world, and good news may not sell, but find a way to tell those stories, because otherwise the fragmenting, disintegrating forces that pull us apart become so dominant. It's certainly about government. We are troubled, and this report is about values, because often government seems to just be an endless cycle of calculation on cost-benefit analyses, as if technocrats and economists, not poets and philosophers and people who are ethicists, have anything to say anymore. It's saying we actually believe well-being is good. You would have read reports that John Fraser, the head of Treasury, has dropped well-being from the measures of Treasury for the last 15 years. He said, well, we measure standard of living. That's really sufficient for well-being. We are saying, no, we don't think it is. It's not about how rich we are. We're already the third richest nation on earth per capita. It's actually about our perspectives on ourselves, our fairness, inclusiveness, creativity, compassion in our communities. Often just raising standards of living is seen as some economic solution to generosity, which is falling. And when we're doing better, we'll be generous. My father, who died in May of this year at the age of 97, he was a school teacher all his life. We lived in a 3-bedroom house. Peter and I shared a bedroom for 18 years. If you want to know why I got interested in justice, when we had our fights, my father would always say, I don't want to know who started it. I don't want to apportion blame. I'm not interested in the story. I'm punishing you both. That's when I got interested in justice. I reckon Peter started it more than me. My father, all his life, gave away 10% of his income and teacher's salary to charity. He felt blessed. He had left school at 14. He'd gone and fought up in New Guinea. He'd lived through depression, got his chance, got an education, became a teacher. He was much poorer off than I am and much more generous when we know that our giving levels have dropped to 0.35%, 35 cents and $100. He was always giving $10 and $100, and he felt this is attitudinal. This is about mood, not just saying when we're richer, then we can go back to being generous. Disadvantage, as we know, is only partly understandable as economic deprivation. Disadvantage in this nation is often closely linked in with poverty. It's not exactly the same thing. It has social, psychological, communal, and even spiritual dimensions as well as economic ones. And this report is asking those questions of the wider dimensions. So how does Australia shape up on the criteria of fairness, opportunity, compassion, justice, well-being for all? Nelson Mandela once said, "No one truly knows a nation until one has been inside its jails." He knew about this, 27 years in jail. He meant that we should judge a society by how it treats those at the bottom of the social scale, those who are invisible, those who even are labelled criminal. He said we are judged by how we treat vulnerable people. How we treat our prisoners and what's happening there tells us a lot about our society in the turning inwards. Australia has a very large imprisonment rate. It's increasing at a significant rate. Australia receives a very negative rating in this report for incarceration. The number of prisoners in Australia rose by 7% in 2015. The rate of imprisonment grew by 6%. Our incarceration rate is 196 people per 100,000. That's higher than any country in Western Europe, double Scandinavian countries, 3 times Ireland, where many of us as a convict society came out from. We're returning to it. And much higher than comparable nations to Australia like Canada. Of course, the outlier is the US, and when you follow this election, you see, or maybe don't see, discussion around that. Of course, right at the heart of this is the incarceration of adult Indigenous people. That is now more than 15 times the imprisonment rate of non-Indigenous Australians. It's revealing, however, that less than 20% of adult prisoners have achieved Year 12 education. 1 in 3 adult prisoners have a disability or a long-term chronic health condition. Indigenous people, those with poor literacy, from poor socioeconomic families, often people with disability, with mental health issues, are grossly overrepresented in the Australian prison population. Not surprisingly, but it's a tragic stat. Imprisonment rates in the Northern Territory are 4 times the national average and are higher percentage-wise than incarceration rates in the US, which is the worst. Western Australia imprisonment rates are almost 50% higher than the national average. They're high also in Queensland. Those 2 states and territories have large Indigenous populations. New South Wales, South Australia are slightly above the national average. Victoria and the ACT have maintained relatively stable imprisonment rates. So our prisons have become more crowded. The response has been to build more of them, lots of law and order agendas, but it's not making our community safer. In fact, one of the shocking stats in this report is nearly 1 in 2 women say they feel unsafe walking in the streets at night, way over the OECD average of women and safety. Nearly 80% of men say they feel perfectly safe walking the streets at night, way over the OECD average for men feeling safe. But the answer to safety, I would suggest, isn't locking up more people. Why? Because we know it's a revolving door between prisons and the community. People in prisons come out. If prison is to deter, it's not doing too well because the recidivism is so high. Prison certainly rarely reforms and rehabilitates, and these people are going to be our neighbours. And that emphasis on rehabilitation would be much more constructive. So we actually have to start to remedy these social inequalities that lead people to offend and re-offend, go back to our values of addressing poverty, sexual abuse, alienation, disability, mental health, the reasons people end up in our prisons. Restorative justice rather than simply retributive justice, which may make us feel good. We shut the slammer and threw the key away, but actually this cycle goes on. The values I think that we need, and this report shows, is hope. Hope that broken lives can be restored. Not everyone, but to keep that hope alive and to find better ways to actually achieve that. The imagination of inclusion, it at least deserves a go, given the way we're going with incarceration. Second chances deserves a go. Didn't this nation start really with that story? Suicide rates, we know about the mass epidemics of depression, anxiety disorders, high suicide rates, family breakdown, addiction, and profound isolation. Isolation because communities are fragmenting. Why, when we are so affluent, are we not flourishing? Our suicide rates are higher than our road toll. On average, 8 people will die today by suicide. The numbers are increasing. The rate of suicide amongst Indigenous Australians is 4 times that of non-Indigenous. And this rate of Australians taking their own lives is typically underreported. We do know that young males are most likely to suicide, that single car accidents described as that are quite probably suicides. The largest increases in males aged 30 to 35, where the number of suicides rose from 161 to 230 in 12 months. Again, Western Australia, Queensland and Northern Territory, high numbers of Indigenous have as a proportion of the population, have significantly higher levels of suicide compared to the national average. Queensland has managed to reduce the suicide rate. It's still above the national average, but they're doing something right. Victoria, New South Wales, ACT are all below the national average. Yet Northern Territory, South Australia and Victoria still have had the biggest increases in suicide in the past 12 months. We are saying here at the Community Council for Australia that suicide is like the canaries in the mines. A warning that depression, defeatism, disillusionment, negativity, relentless negativity actually has a cost. It actually has a cost. And our culture, part of Western culture, is not necessarily as well equipped as we think it should be. Its hallmarks, individualism, liberalism, materialism, consumerism, secularism, economic rationalism, can all be strengths. We're suggesting they may actually be great liabilities too when it comes to establishing sound mental health and community and hope in the population. We must find a better way. The better way, by the way, is not just retribalising, which we're seeing globally. I say the old gods of blood and soil are roaring back. Of blood, which leads to racism, Mexicans are all rapists. Of soil that leads to nationalism, we'll just stop all Muslims coming. These old gods often sacrifice refugees and certain races and religions on the altar of these gods. Retribalising identity. It makes us feel we belong to a group of blood and soil. But it's narrow. It's exclusive. It evaporates empathy and profound connection. And it's foolish. National sovereignty simply cannot solve the great challenges our world is facing. Refugees, terror, climate change, banking crises, global flu epidemics or other epidemics, they're borderless. They're borderless. The world is a waterbed. You press down here, it comes up here. So finding identity by the in-group and saying we're committed at the core and closing off the edges is foolish. Yes, we need identity, but we also need open edges. We can't sacrifice open edges in a global world just for false identity with these old gods of blood and soil. When it comes to income distribution and access to education, it's a bit more positive. The report rates Australia above average compared to other OECD countries in equality of access to employment, education levels, and business confidence. But there is still scope for improvement. The report gives Australia a negative rating on fair income distribution. We know income and wealth inequality is becoming an issue here. Thomas Piketty's been here reminding us of that this week. In 2013-14, the average weekly wage of disposable household income was $998. That was up from $964 3 years ago in 2010-11. But over the same period, Australia's income distribution has become much more unequal. In 2012, a person in the top 20% income group in Australia had 5 times as much income as someone in the bottom 20%. Still a full-time job, but bottom 20%, the top 20% was earning 5 times more. This is emerging as a political issue. Books in America of falling apart have actually really nailed this as the American challenge. And we know, though we've had a better social security, social transfer system, here in Australia, it is now emerging. On educational attainment, the report shows not everyone gets an equal opportunity. Access to education varies across locations and population groups. Research has shown that children from low socioeconomic backgrounds and children whose parents have low levels of education perform less well in school than children from higher economic status and more educated families. More than 1 in 5 Australians in 2014 did not complete secondary education. Do I hear anyone say the word Gonski? Although both business and consumer confidence is on the rise, consumer confidence is still below the index benchmark of 100 and the OECD average. Certainly, increased cost of living is putting financial pressures on households. But if politicians keep saying to us, we feel your pain, your energy bill's going up, yes, you're a victim, we know this perspective actually blocks the move we have to make to renewables. And we need to think out these values that we've outlined in this report, not setting them off against each other, or at least if we're doing so wittingly, knowingly. Australia is still in the top 20 of countries globally in terms of government transparency, but only just. We're slipping down the global index of transparency. We've declined 7% since 2012. This report gives Australia just a 0 on transparency and perceptions of corruption. Female participation here is on the rise in employment, but well below male participation and opportunity. Women are also much more likely to work part-time. Men are much more likely to work full-time. The full-time gender pay gap still stands at 17.3% nationally. Victoria and Western Australia are the only 2 states with a gap between male and female employment to population ratio higher than the national average. When we start to think about personal security, and I've alluded to this, 1 in 3 people in Australia do not feel safe when walking alone at night. 1 in 2 women saying they do not feel safe. ACT and Tasmania are well above the national average. They're improving. They've achieved a positive score. I could talk about CO2 emissions and sustainability, but that would be another topic. It's in the report. When it comes to generosity, we certainly think of ourselves as a generous nation. Yet the level of individual philanthropic giving is still below 2009. And when revenue available to governments is falling in real terms and grants to charities is falling, with only increasing community expectations of charities doing their job, you've got a squeeze that's very stressful for charities. On average, Australian taxpayers donated 0.35% of their taxable income, 35 cents in $100. And this is still lower than 42 cents that we were giving in 2007-2008. Australians give significantly less than individuals in the US, less than comparable countries such as Canada and the United Kingdom. We've been far less generous since the global financial crisis. We've turned inwards. We've said we're in pain. It's evaporated empathy and compassion when the best thing you can do as a parent for your children is say, you know, we are blessed. You can make a difference. You can give something of your pocket money. That actually breeds hope, maybe even resilience against depression and suicide and mental illness. Australia is ranked in the top 10 OECD nations for volunteering, but volunteering is in decline across every state and territory. That's a worry. We know when you volunteer and connect and form relationships, this is one of the best things you can do for your emotional and mental health. The shock to me is how many Australians actually have the capacity to volunteer but are retreating. I see it in slogans. T-shirts are like slogans. I was walking with my wife down the street and a young woman had her T-shirt on. It's like a billboard. It said, "Me, hard to find, impossible to forget." I thought, well, she's got a pretty healthy self-esteem. Kept walking. The next young woman had a T-shirt that said, "Kate is my religion." I was so struck, I stopped and said, "Is your name Kate?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Kate, are you your own religion?" She said, "Yes, I worship and adore myself." I said, "All the best with your religion, Kate." The self is too brittle a sight for meaning. Volunteering is an expression of saying it's in community, in serving, in a deeper transcendent purpose. I find true meaning. International development aid, I won't go on about this, you've heard me talk many times, but when we are at our lowest ever in our history, most generous under Bob Menzies, now at our lowest ever, we are at 0.22%, 22 cents in $100. Our promise is 70 cents. We slashed it in the first Abbott hockey budget. 20% of his budget savings came from aid. Aid's only 1% of the budget. 20% of the savings came from aid, which is literally life-saving and hope-giving. What was another Conservative government doing, David Cameron? With much higher public debt to GNI, about 80%, ours was 15%, David Cameron legislated 0.7%. Against complaints, he said, "We won't balance the books in England on the backs of the poor." This is a sign of this turning inwards. England's a long way, Britain's a long way, from the world's poor. They're right in our region. Well, I'll let you go through the state-by-state conclusions and the core values that are in this. Certainly, I think there are a whole lot of conversations that come out of this. I could talk about negative gearing and the fact that supply, in my view, won't do it for young owner-occupiers when 40% are investors. I think John Alexander on the coalition side gets it right. He says an ordinary tennis player can never win against Roger Federer. Owner-occupier who is young can never win in a house auction against an investor. We've got to look at capital gains, negative gearing. I was really thrilled Thomas Piketty went to inheritance tax. I committed political suicide on Melbourne radio about July of this year, suggesting the same. They went ballistic at me. They tax us when we're alive, and now you want them to be taxed when we die. I said, look, it's never a good time to pay tax. But surely the best time to pay it is when you've died. And by the way, you still leave enough for your kids. If you leave them too much, you'll only ruin your kids. Here's Thomas Piketty saying the rest of the world has inheritance tax. What's wrong with Australia? These are conversations, policy discussions we can have, but I just want to finish by saying the ancient Jewish rabbis used to say, God is like a mirror. The mirror never changes, but everyone who looks at it sees a different face. We actually need to see the face of our neighbour, of the refugee, of saying if John Howard could settle Manus and Nauru by quietly resettling people without boats all starting up again because turn back worked, this poisoning of our soul with warehousing people on Manus and Nauru, just to say otherwise all the boats start up, we actually can settle this. There are ways we can deal with this. They, on Manus and Nauru, I believe in my faith, are made in the image of God with the same hopes as my children. When we think about the mirror, we've got to see others. We have to be empathetic. We actually have to know, just like the old game of pick up sticks, where if you find the key stick, all the others follow, that relationships and community is the key stick. Whether it's drug abuse, depression, inequality, suicide, this is the key stick. It's our Australia. It's the Australia we want. These are the values I recommend to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Tim, for a really thought-provoking address. I might kick off our period of questions and answers by inviting you to pick up where you left off with the observation that when politicians talk about we feel your pain, how that stymies a transition to renewable energies in your view. If politicians aren't saying or shouldn't be saying we feel your pain, what sort of message do you think they should be projecting to the Australian public in terms of achieving the kind of vision you've outlined on many indicators?
I think politicians do have to learn to speak a language of values, not just economic language, firstly. Secondly, there are people who are hurting in Australia, but a lot of us aren't. I was profoundly struck, having been a bit critical of the Conservative government, now let me be critical of Labor, when Julia Gillard was mooting raising income tax on people over 250 grand a year. One of her front benchers, member for Newcastle, actually said, I know a lot of people on 250 grand who are struggling, are battling. I was shocked. If you're on 250 grand plus a year, you're in the top 1% of income earners. Now you're a battler. Suddenly everyone's hurting. This is a profound loss of perspective. I think what politicians need to be saying is a much more nuanced message. There are people who are struggling, but it's not all of us. And actually, politics, as Aristotle described it, is really an attempt to live together. That's all politics is. And we all come apart at the seams if we can't actually have this discussion from those of us who we all like more money and higher pay or whatever, but can't get perspective that we're not the battlers. Compare it to previous generations who, as I described, were often far more generous. When it comes to renewables, of course politicians, to get our votes, will all feel our pain. Well, the pain if we do not deal with climate change is extraordinary and global. So actually talking directly and honestly and transparently about that. If I had my way in politics today, and this ain't going to happen, I would encourage the left of centre with the right of centre, the natural middle centre to say, let's get over the hyper-partisanship, the revolving door of prime ministers, the negativity, and let's recognise that both at right and left, those extremes are eating away at us. So let's together, with some bipartisanship, say this is where we are as a nation. This is the vision for where we want to get to, and these are the bipartisan steps we can agree on to actually make that journey, because the profound disconnection from politics is extraordinary. Nick Xenophon, who I was with this morning, gave me an extraordinary example. A 19-year-old at a petrol station, this guy who was serving him said, "Do you know who this is? This is a senator." And the guy goes, "I don't care who he is. I'm not interested in politics. I don't even know who the Prime Minister is." And Nick said, "How old are you?" 19. "You don't know who the Prime Minister is?" He said, "No, I don't know and I don't care." And Nick said, "Did you vote?" And this young guy said, yes, I voted. Nick said, "Well, who did you vote for?" He said, "That guy Xenophon." And the petrol station, "That's him, this is him." Well, the disconnect is dangerous because politics is a high vocation. It's how we live together. And the high partisanship and negativity actually is turning people off, so that those challenges of sustainability and the move to renewable energies often are just a green concern or a left concern. That's how I'd respond.
The disconnect is profound, but perhaps the Xenophon product placement is impeccable. Our next question is from Alex Beach from the ABC.
Hi. The government's announced an inquiry into the incarceration rates of Indigenous Australians. You've been talking today about the importance of focusing on rehabilitation and restorative justice in particular. What sort of focus or terms of reference would you like to see in that inquiry?
So I welcome that. I think this is simply extraordinary. World Vision works in many Indigenous communities up in the Kimberley, sitting with Indigenous men who can show you, because their bush knowledge is so fantastic, their equivalent of the Opera House and Sydney Harbour Bridge and bush cultural assets, so such rich knowledge. I was sitting with them in our ranges, we're training them in leadership and saying, "How many of you have been in prison?" A group of about 15, every single one of them had been in prison. And I just remember being overwhelmed emotionally, saying, before we came with white settlement, you weren't ever criminals. You actually understood and lived a life that you still in part understand with your bushcraft. And something about settlement here turned people who weren't criminals into criminals. There's something about the impact of our culture, laws, that's actually not working here. So I welcome this. I think this is really important. When we look at incarceration rates, Tasmania, one of the reasons it does well is because charities were invited in to deal with juvenile detention rather than just locking up young people again. Trust, relationship, working with them, providing skills really turned around that high incarceration rate there. And whatever comes out of this inquiry, I think there's some positive answers that go to the things in this report.
Our next question is from Rachel Baxendale from The Australian.
Mr Costello, in 2014 you called for the base of the GST to be broadened to things including school fees, fresh food, water, sewerage, childcare, private school fees I think in particular. And last year Malcolm Turnbull did put that idea on the table very briefly. Is that an idea, your 2014 idea, something you still stand by? And I guess, is this an argument and a debate that we will need to continue to return to until there is change?
Boy, I hate databases and press a button and up comes an old comment, but thank you for the question. I argued for that because as part of my C20, Civil Society 20 work with the G20, going to so many G20 meetings where they're always going to close tax havens, I just realised nothing's happening here. There's not actually the will. So a GST is one way the rich at least pay something. Our dirty little secrets were exposed in Mossack Fonseca, have I got that right? 800 wealthy Australians, we still don't know their names. But that sense that our welfare net and this debate, which turns ugly in scapegoating unemployed or people on sickness benefits because of the cost, and it's too costly because of the income base, I said, well, at least if we have a GST and it's broad-based and you have some exemptions, but it's broad-based, at least stops that inexorable blaming, we can't afford you, because I believe in a world where jobs are casualised. With robotisation, they're probably going to start disappearing. Where inequity is growing, that's why a safety net, a social transfer system is so profoundly important. And my hunch was this will become the target if we can't broaden the tax base, which is why I argued then for a GST. I personally think there's been a little bit of progress on tax havens, but we're not going to get there for another 20 years. We don't have with national sovereignty, we simply don't have any international enforcement transparency system to ever get there. So that's why I made those comments.
Our next question today is from Catherine Murphy from Guardian Australia.
Hello, Tim. Thank you for your speech. You've given us a bunch of really fascinating indicators that present a picture of where Australian society is at and how we could improve the sort of our community values. But I want to take you back to the gods of blood and soil for a minute and tribalism. There's a bunch of things that we can measure that are going on that indicate that society's heading in a certain way, but I'm not certain from what you've said what you think the underlying cause of that is. Because we see it in Australia, we see it in the UK, we see it in America. It's not something distinct to the Australian experience. And unlike those other places, Australia avoided a major economic downturn, and yet we still have some of those cultural factors that you're talking about. So what is it? Is it inequality? Is it some sort of anti-globalisation kind of response where people are sort of resorting to sovereignty as being some sort of panacea? What's the underlying cause, do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. I'll have a stab. I personally think that the growth of wealth without it actually seeing, particularly in America, the middle class sharing in the pie. In other countries, the same story of you have growing overall wealth because free trade does work, protectionism is turning inwards. But without redistributive measures, without proper safety nets, without proper supports for those who lose in globalisation and free trade with retraining and skills, has actually thrown up a very particular scenario that allows populists to say, those scapegoats, those people of that colour, that religion, those people who are in China trading with America, they're the ones to blame. And populism does that. And I think those old gods are those populist gods, scapegoats that you blame for the pain that is real because there are winners and losers in globalisation. Overall, with globalisation, we all should win. The truth is many haven't won, and they're looking for scapegoats. So the Donald comes along and he's never seen a complex problem he doesn't have a simple solution for. Mexicans build a wall, Muslims ban them. Cost of NATO, well, give nuclear weapons to Saudi Arabia and Japan and South Korea. And how different is that to the leadership in America, wise, sage leadership in a much worse time? We think we're in terrible times. World War II and the aftermath was much worse. And America, against those voices that said forever punish Germany, had the Marshall Plan and said, let's actually look long term and rebuild, because they're losers and you can't keep them humiliated. They'd learned from the Treaty of Versailles and the humiliation. So we need that wise international leadership that also says when people are hurting and we move to the popular scapegoating, which is all that's happening, we actually need to show that we are addressing those pains justly, transparently, equitably. So my stab is probably inequality is right at the heart of it. Catherine?
Our next question today is from Tim Shaw from 2CC.
Tim Costello, thank you so much for your address and welcome to Canberra. It's great to have you here. The Young Australians of the Year, 2 young Brisbane boys that washed the clothes of the homeless, Orange Sky Laundry, and we recognised them because they identified that not only do we need to make and help those homeless feel cleaner and better about themselves, but engage them in conversation. We're sad to say here that in the ACT we have the highest rate of homelessness in the nation. We have one of the highest rates of Indigenous incarceration in the nation per capita. We also have 18,000 16 to 24-year-olds, according to the DSS, in the June numbers, who are in some way, shape or form receiving a welfare payment. In your speech, you want to engage Australia in a new narrative. I guess that's the feeling, a more compassionate Australia, instead of the bad news blame game, like the front page of the Daily Telegraph, a woman and a man who have had 8 children removed from them because of their poor parenting skills. What would you like Canberrans to do? We're here now, 18,000 Canberrans receiving a social welfare payment between 16 and 24. What would you like older Canberrans to say to those younger Canberrans? And in fact, as part of this whole process of the Australian of the Year award, should the next Australian of the Year, young Australian of the Year, be a young homeless person? Should the next senior Australian of the Year be an aged pensioner who has reached out and helped his or her community? How do you hope to change this narrative? Because the politicians can't.
Sure.
That's clearly evident. What's your thoughts on that? And it's an ambitious day here in Canberra. It's the day of ambitious ideas, so I'd like your ambitious answer. Thank you.
So Canberra has a day for ambitious ideas, does it? Okay. Well, there you go. I'm reminded of a sibling of mine who said, people in Canberra live like Toorak and vote like Footscray. And the homelessness, unlike where World Vision works in 60 plus countries, isn't a lack of shelter. Literally, from the Philippines to so many countries, people are sleeping on the streets because they have no even squat. Homelessness in Australia is the lack of a safe place. There are any number of spare bedrooms in Canberra tonight. It's conflict within families, it's mental illness, it's abuse, it's that sense of there's more community sometimes in the street than I feel at home and in my neighbourhood. People might find this difficult to believe, but at Urban Seed that I set up, we would send out our workers with $2 in their pocket at 10 o'clock at night and say, we'll see you for breakfast at 8 in the morning. And they would say, where am I going to eat? Well, you'll find some homeless. And where am I going to sleep? Well, you know, this is the training ground. When they come back in the morning, what always blew them away was the level of community on the streets. It really blew them away. Don't waste your money, $2 there at McDonald's. You know, Rosie's is coming along with coffee better than McDonald's in an hour. This is a place where we can sleep. We'll take you there. And this was important training for a penny to drop, to say, surprising as it seems, the streets sometimes gave greater safety and community than what people felt in their own homes. And that's why they'd fled. So it goes to not simply shelter, but relationship and community and dealing with violence and abuse and certainly proper support services. And the one good thing in the report, well, there's a few good things, but one of the good things in the report on volunteering was volunteering is increasing. The only group increasing in Australia is between 15 to 17-year-olds. We often like to be down on young people. This is actually the bright spot. I suspect the reasons have to do with schools who are saying, we just don't want you to be academic, get a great HSC to get a job. We want you to be well-rounded. And they partner with soup kitchens, have Indigenous programs, partner with World Vision. But that story you began with was a lovely story of what we're seeing many young Australians do in volunteering.
Our next question today is from Sabra Lane from the ABC.
Thank you very much for your speech. Tim, I've got a couple of questions. It's interesting that you talked about the disconnect in your speech. I spoke with someone this morning who talks with focus groups for a living, and they said that the disconnect now in the community is actually quite stronger now than when it was at the election, and that they both see everybody up the hill is living in a bubble, and that they're talking about nothing of relevance to them at all. That things like same-sex marriage, while they might agree, that they just think that has got nothing to do with my everyday life. A pox on all your houses. And they said they really worried that if we had a Trump-like figure here, that right now they would be elected. How do the politicians overcome that disconnect? The other interesting point in conversations I've had in the past 24 hours is a former respected public service chief reminded me that while we've gone through 30 years of economic reform, things like the floating of the dollar, taking down of barriers, etc., that it took us 15 years to get to that point. And he says we're at the starting point now, that it's going to take us at least another 10, 15 years to get some major reform. Do you agree? And can we afford to wait that long?
Yeah. Well, on the disconnect, I, in the speech, suggested that partisan politics is actually now not just having unintended consequences, it's having profoundly counterproductive consequences. That people feel if it's not optimistic, if there's not a way forward, if it's not hopeful, it's not for them. And politics is just not for them. And I think that's a very dangerous time for the reason you said, that a Trump-like figure, that's where populists actually thrive. I was personally pretty shocked to see 49% of Australians, if Essential poll was right, saying stop all Muslim migration. I'm very against ISIS, I'm very against the awful brutality, but do we actually want to tar 1.2 billion people on the planet as actually the same as ISIS? This is madness. And this sense that somehow they're all the same is really troubling for me. So to your question of disconnection, I think politicians actually have to say whatever winning the day or the week in politics, this, one, is not being particularly noticed, two, is corrosive. This is not speaking to the deeper values that we're expecting now, which is why I suggested some bipartisanship, some way of the centre actually saying these extremes, let's find a way to work together. Secondly, I don't know what to say about the head of the pub, or one of the departments who said that. I think that's probably right. Reform is always hard. The trouble is we're not even agreed on what the word reform means. Reform usually means more market forces, less safety nets. It's, Carlton and United Brewery who seem to sack their workers, offer them their jobs back on less money. Reform has sort of got a whole lot of devil in the detail. And I would ban the word reform unless you actually explained what precisely you're talking about when you use that word.
Our next question today is from Peter Phillips.
Tim, Peter Phillips, one of the directors of the National Press Club. It's always great to welcome you back here, the club, our membership, those attending our functions, and the wider broadcast audience derive great benefit from your insight and for your compassion. I take you back to an earlier question. You reflected on recent examples, ongoing rejection of existent forms and norms. We see what's happened with Brexit most recently, and then as an outgrowth of that, what is now happening with the refugee efflux with Syria, with we come to what we are now faced with next Wednesday week in the United States, and the indication of the values and of the inclinations which might inform the policy of an incoming Trump administration. Seems to me that all of this, and that's before we even go to the 22 cents in the $100 of the first budget of the incoming government in Australia, and what might be the figure in the next year's budget here. But it seems to me that all of this bodes ominously, that has ominous portents for the philanthropic sector. Can you, from your perspective, can you use this forum to advocate a circuit breaker? Is there an antidote? There probably isn't. But if there's an antidote, what is it? What is required within governments, particularly within the West, to change the course, to change the mindset?
Let me start with the philanthropic sector. So what we know, quite apart from generosity dropping, is there is a compassion fatigue that is set in because charities, the philanthropic sector, have not really disciplined themselves as we should. By that I mean sharing back offices, making sure there's not reduplicating of services. David Crosby and I have been leading forums with CEOs of not-for-profits saying, where can we cooperate better? Because the proliferation of so many different not-for-profits means compassion fatigue sets in. People are going, oh, I don't know about this one, is it better than this one, what are the overheads? And we're sort of often confusing people. There's been negative press, rightly negative, about chuggers and not-for-profit charities. Thankfully World Vision's not one of these, employing people to get donations and not even paying them a fair wage. You can't practice what you don't preach here. So we are taking seriously as the Community Council for Australia, saying how do we actually bring some both coherence and robustness to what we do rather than letting compassion fatigue just grow. Look, as to your other points there, Peter, I think most of us have been quite shocked how quickly the winds, ill winds, have blown across Europe. Angela Merkel, in my view, was being very courageous, saying we can welcome as Europeans with 500 million people, 1 million people. Geisler, who was a former deputy to Chancellor Kohl, a Conservative, said, if you're at a party, you've got 500 guests and one extra turns up, who would say, sorry, we don't have room for you? In other words, this isn't impossible. Well, what's become impossible is public attitude to say, no way. And this is not happening. And Australia's been at the forefront, and lecturing others they should do what we do for a long time, without a trace of irony that we're a nation continent where others all share land mass borders, so they can't do what we do. So I think that populist ill wind, I've called it, the old gods are surging back. And we know this chapter in history. We know even greater chaos it can lead to. We have to find ways to name and not serve and sacrifice people to those old gods for the sake of international order. When it comes to refugees, I say, look, 65 million displaced people, it's about 2 million only who are going to be refugees. Let's be proactive. Let's actually say, yep, turn back. Australians will not accept open borders. That's just the political equation. But let's significantly lift our humanitarian intake. It's not even back to where Labor had it at 20,000. And yet Malcolm, the Prime Minister, announced in the UN that we're being more generous. We're going to 18,500. Well, it was 20,000 under Labor. I think it should be 30,000. I think if you've got secure borders, when you're taking some 200,000 a year anyway. We actually then can say to other nations, the problem's not going away. Let's be proactive. We're lifting our humanitarian intake. We have to solve this together. Simply pulling up the drawbridge of nations and saying, we're okay, your problem. It's always been Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey's problem. Kenya, Dadaab camp where I've been. It's 250,000 people who've been there 25 years waiting. But it's been Kenya's problem. They're mainly Somalis. We actually have to have a global approach to this that's proactive, not simply defensive in a nationalistic way. That would be my response.
We are hard up against the clock, but we have time for one last question from Ken Randall.
Thank you. Tim, just going back to Sabra Lane's question, it seems to me that the turnaround towards an inward-looking attitude in the community almost directly reflects the change in political discourse over the last couple of decades. Do you think you could get a change in the public attitude without a change in the political attitude?
I think the economic, technocratic political discourse is one of the main problems that we have at political level now. It wasn't so long ago that columns in the paper would more likely not be economic writers and technocrats and consultants, but poets, philosophers, theologians. There was a sense that actually what nourishes the soul, breeds optimism, is this extraordinary awe that we get one go at life. We're all fragile humans trying to get by. We actually need to share that pain and solidarity, not just negative solidarities about my group. And I think that discourse is really important from our political leaders. I think it will be very difficult to change public attitudes, even though I'm saying a little bit like I've given up on government. We actually have to find a way as communities to do it, but it will be very hard to change without a change in political discourse too.
And on that note, we'll draw things to a close. Would you please thank Tim Costello? We always like to give a little gift to our guest speakers. I did some database research also before this, and the memorable moment from a previous Tim Costello address that I loved was when he was invited to comment on his brother's prime ministerial ambitions in 2007, and he was here at the club. He talked about the prime ministership being something like the ring of Sauron, that whoever wore the ring thought they could control it, but in fact the ring controlled them. I think today's address has given us much important food for thought about the kind of society we're building, but it's also given us that cracker of an anecdote about where Tim Costello's sense of injustice was born. So thank you so much, Tim.
Thank you so much. That's great.